The compound sat deep in the woods, hidden far from any roads, surrounded by tall, dark trees. The buildings were old and weathered, their wood chipped and gray, but they were treated with reverence by everyone there. To the followers, this place was sacred ground, the only true haven from a world they believed had fallen into sin. Barbed wire wrapped around the perimeter, and a plain wooden gate bore the message, "The light of truth shall purify all." Amara had spent all 17 years of her life inside these gates, where her father, Elias, ruled over the followers. She was obedient and quiet, but under the surface, questions began to rise, restless and uneasy. Lately, she was starting to wonder about her father's real intentions, though she pushed these thoughts down, fearful of what they might mean. Elias held complete control over the compound and everyone within it. To the followers, he was the shepherd, the man who claimed to be chosen by God. His voice was deep and powerful, capable of lifting spirits or instilling fear with a single word. When he stood at the front of the prayer hall, a large, rugged building in the center of the compound, his followers hung on his every word, convinced that only he knew the way to salvation. Every sermon warned of a sinful world outside and the need to obey every rule inside these walls. The rules Elias enforced were strict. Women were to remain silent, to dress modestly, and to always keep their heads down in prayer. Children were raised to be obedient, to respect every command without question. Those who broke these rules faced harsh punishments that Elias called purifications, days of silence, fasting, or isolation in a small dark room. No one dared to challenge him. But Amara felt a strange, growing fear around her father. She had seen his eyes linger on her too long during sermons, or the way his hand would rest on her shoulder just a bit too firmly. There was a coldness in his gaze that made her feel trapped, like a bird in a cage. She knew she was supposed to be loyal to him, but something in her heart felt unsettled. Each day, the walls of the compound seemed to close in tighter. The symbols carved on every building, the crosses towering over them. It all felt heavier now, like chains binding her in place. And though Amara kept her doubts hidden, a small spark of defiance grew in her, whispering that maybe this life was not as holy as she'd been told. In her heart, she sensed a darkness waiting, a secret her father kept hidden behind his sermons and smiles, something she feared could destroy them both. Elias's attention toward Amara had always made her uneasy, but lately it had shifted into something far more unsettling. He had begun summoning her to his private quarters for what he called special purifications. While other followers were subjected to long prayers or periods of fasting for minor transgressions, Amara's purifications were more intense. Her father would make her kneel alone before him, repeating her vows to remain pure and unshaken by temptation. He would hold her hands, his grip firm, his eyes searching hers in a way that felt anything but fatherly. These sessions were private, carried out after dark when no one else was around to see. Elias would close the door and begin his ritualistic lecture, speaking in a low, fervent tone about how Amara was different from the others. "You're not like them," he'd say, his gaze intense. "You are chosen, Amara. Only you can carry on my vision." At first, she dismissed it as just his usual devotion, a father's pride in his daughter, but it became clear that Elias's intentions went deeper and darker. The first time he referred to her as the chosen one, Amara felt a chill spread through her. He spoke about a divine role, explaining that it was her duty to stay within the compound, to learn his ways so that she could lead the followers when he was gone. He even hinted at a union between them, something sacred and binding. Amara's skin crawled as his words became more possessive, his affection increasingly laced with obsession. She realized with horror that he wasn't grooming her for a spiritual path, he was grooming her for himself. Her heart pounded each time she left those sessions, a sick feeling rising in her stomach. She began to avoid his gaze, feeling his eyes on her even when she was surrounded by others. His sermons, once impersonal, now seemed to hold messages directed solely at her. He would preach about obedience, loyalty, and sacred duties, all while looking directly at her, his voice heavy with implication. She sensed that everyone else noticed too, though no one dared to question it. Terrified, Amara started to plan her escape. She had never seen the world outside the compound, but she knew there had to be something beyond these walls. She began gathering scraps of information, trying to piece together what lay beyond the forest. She confided in Jonas, a quiet but observant young man who had recently joined the community. Jonas had his own reservations about Elias. He could see the hypocrisy and power hunger hidden behind the leader's words. Together, they began to talk in whispers, their conversations hurried and filled with half-formed plans. One night, as the others slept, they met at the edge of the gardens, hidden by the shadows of tall trees. "I have to leave," Amara whispered, her voice shaking. "If I stay here, he'll never let me go. He thinks I belong to him." Jonas's eyes darkened with understanding. "I know," he replied softly. "I've seen the way he looks at you. It's wrong." Their plans were risky, especially since Elias had eyes everywhere. The slightest sign of rebellion could mean punishment, or worse. But as each day passed, Amara's anxiety grew. She could feel her father's intentions closing in on her, a trap tightening. He had taken to calling her his light, and speaking of a holy bond that would keep her tied to him forever. His words were both cryptic and terrifying, filling her with dread that she couldn't shake. Then, one evening during a sermon, Elias suddenly turned his gaze on Amara, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper that made the congregation hold their breath. "A pure heart cannot stray," he intoned, his eyes boring into her. "The chosen must remain close, must fulfill their role at my side. Only together can we save this fallen world." The entire hall went silent as his words echoed. Amara's heart pounded painfully in her chest as her father held her in his gaze, his eyes dark with something she could no longer deny. Amara's fear deepened with each passing day. She knew she had to act soon, to find a way out before his control over her became inescapable. She felt like a bird with clipped wings, trapped in a cage crafted by the very man who claimed to love her. And with each glance, each private session, each whispered word, the walls of that cage drew closer, the door closing tight. The night was cold and quiet as Amara and Jonas slipped from the small shed behind the gardens, moving through the shadows toward the edge of the compound. They had waited until the compound's last lights were out, praying they wouldn't be noticed as they approached the unguarded section of the fence where the barbed wire was loose. They had timed everything carefully, whispering plans for days, and tonight had felt like their only chance. Amara's heart thundered as she crept forward, Jonas close beside her. They kept low, barely breathing, feeling the weight of the compound's dark silence bearing down on them. She could see freedom just a few yards away. One step past the fence, and they'd be gone, leaving behind the walls, the rules, and, most importantly, her father's shadow. But just as she reached the fence, a strong hand clamped down on her shoulder, and she gasped. "Amara," came the deep, cold voice that froze her blood. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Elias. Within moments, they were pulled back toward the center of the compound, where a few loyal followers gathered, their faces blank and obedient. Elias held Amara's wrist tightly, forcing her to her knees in front of the others. Jonas, held by two guards, looked shaken but defiant. Elias stared down at them, his eyes blazing with fury. "You thought you could run!" Elias spat, his voice echoing across the compound. He turned his gaze on Jonas, his face twisting with contempt. "This outsider thinks he can corrupt my own daughter, lead her into sin and away from the truth." He raised his voice so all could hear. "But we will show him the error of his ways." Elias motioned to the guards, who forced Jonas to his knees and pinned him down. Amara struggled, desperate to stop what was happening, but Elias held her in place, making her watch. He lifted a long, slender rod, striking Jonas across the back with a sickening crack that made Amara flinch. Each strike fell harder than the last, Elias's fury punctuating every blow. "This is what happens to those who defy our holy mission," Elias intoned, his eyes fixed on Amara. "This is the price of rebellion." He glanced down at her, his face calm, as if performing a sacred duty. When he was satisfied, he turned to the gathering followers and declared, "Jonas has led my daughter astray, tempted her from her path. but I will not lose her. As the crowd dispersed, Elias led Amara back to his quarters, his grip bruising her arm. She tried to pull away, but he held on firmly, guiding her into the dimly lit room and closing the door. Alone, he dropped his calm facade, letting an intensity seep into his gaze that made her skin crawl. "You thought you could leave?" he asked softly, his voice laced with quiet rage. "You are my daughter, my chosen one. You belong here, with me." His fingers brushed her cheek, and she recoiled, feeling a sick, possessive hunger in his touch. "The world outside is filled with corruption. Only I can keep you pure, Amara. Only I can guide you to your divine purpose." Her heart raced, horror building as she understood the depth of his delusion. "Father, this isn't right. I am not your prisoner. I'm your daughter. I have a right to live my own life," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She had never dared to speak to him this way before, but something inside her had snapped. Elias's face darkened, his eyes narrowing in anger. "You don't know what you're saying. The world out there would destroy you. Only I can save you." He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin. "You will remain here, Amara, forever. We are bound by a sacred duty." "No," she replied, her voice sharper now. "I don't believe you anymore. You're not a prophet. You're a monster, and you're not keeping me here against my will." She tried to pull away, but he held her fast, his expression shifting from anger to something darker, something unhinged. "Do you think you can defy me?" he whispered. "After everything I've done for you, for this community? You belong to me, Amara. You will fulfill your purpose, whether you like it or not." He stepped back, his eyes cold and calculating. "Tomorrow, you will undergo a purification. We'll cleanse this foolishness from your mind. I will bring you back to the path." Amara felt a surge of desperation, her stomach twisting with fear and disgust. For the first time, she fully understood the lengths her father was willing to go to keep her bound to him. She was nothing more than an extension of his twisted vision, a possession to control. That night, lying alone in her small, dark room, Amara felt the final threads of her obedience snap. She knew that as long as she stayed in the compound, Elias would never release her. He would continue his purifications, his grooming, until he had complete control. There was only one option left: escape. She would find a way, no matter what it took, no matter the risks. Because now she understood. If she stayed, he would never stop, and she would lose herself forever. Elias's voice rang out across the compound as he announced a sacred purification for his daughter Amara. He declared to all that she had fallen to temptation and needed a divine cleansing. The followers listened with awe, believing this ritual would save her, binding her forever to their faith. None of them knew what he truly planned, trusting that their prophet, their shepherd, would guide her back to holiness. As the compound prepared for the ceremony, Elias ordered the ceremonial hall decorated with symbols of faith, crosses, candles, and thick ropes, meant for the ritual. To everyone else, this looked like a holy preparation, but for Elias, the ritual was something darker. This would be his final way to keep her under his control, no matter what it took. Locked in her room, Amara felt trapped. She knew this purification would not save her. It was her father's way of forcing her to submit. She realized she had only one choice: to escape, and to do it tonight. Sarah, one of the younger cult members, had started to see the cracks in Elias's teachings and doubted his true intentions. Out of compassion and shared fear, she promised to help Amara flee. They planned to leave under the cover of night, just hours before the ritual. That night, as shadows fell over the compound, Sarah led Amara through a side path in the darkness. They crept past guards and followers, moving quietly toward the fence at the edge of the compound. Amara's heart pounded as she took one step closer to freedom. But just as they reached the fence, a dark figure stepped in front of them. Elias. He looked furious, his face lit by the lantern he carried, his eyes sharp and accusing. "Did you think I wouldn't know?" he whispered, his voice cold. Before Amara could react, he grabbed her arm, pulling her away from Sarah, who fled in terror. Elias dragged Amara back to the compound, leading her to the ceremonial hall. Inside, candles flickered, casting an eerie glow. The heavy ropes hung ominously from the ceiling. The air was thick with incense, choking her as Elias forced her to stand at the center of the room. "Why are you doing this?" Amara's voice shook. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron tight. "Because you are mine," he said softly, his voice dark with possessive affection. "You are my light, Amara. The world would corrupt you, but I can keep you pure." Amara felt a shiver of terror. "I'm your daughter. You're supposed to protect me, not trap me," she replied, her voice defiant for the first time. "You're a monster." Elias's face twisted with rage, but he forced a calm smile. "You don't understand. You were born for this, to carry on my legacy. God brought you to me for a reason." She looked at him, horror and disgust filling her. "I don't want your legacy," she said, her voice rising. "I don't want anything to do with you. Let me go." "No," he hissed, stepping closer, his eyes dark with a terrifying intensity. "You belong here. You belong to me. If you won't stay willingly, I'll keep your soul bound to me in death." His fingers brushed her cheek, and she pulled away, revulsion in her eyes. Suddenly, he seized the ropes hanging nearby, binding her wrists with slow, deliberate movements. Amara struggled, but he was too strong. "This is your salvation," he murmured. "Together we will be bound, just as God intended." Amara fought back tears, fear and fury boiling within her. "Please don't do this," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I don't want this. Just let me go. I don't belong here." But Elias only tightened the ropes, his face twisted with an obsessive devotion. "You will stay with me, forever." Just then, a loud crash broke the silence. The doors burst open, and a group of cult members, led by Sarah and Jonas, rushed in. They froze at the sight of Elias, his twisted ritual laid bare before them. For a moment he looked stunned, his control slipping as he saw their horrified faces. "You can't take her from me," he shouted, his voice wild. "She is mine! She is chosen!" The followers stood in shock, their trust in their prophet finally cracking as the truth of his obsession became clear. As Elias's grip on her loosened, Amara wrenched herself free, stumbling into Jonas's arms as he shielded her from her father's enraged gaze. Elias, now powerless, watched as his followers turned from him, their faith in him shattered. His daughter, the person he had tried so desperately to bind to himself, was slipping away, taking his control with her. Jonas and Sarah led Amara away from the hall and into the open air, finally beyond her father's grasp. Elias was left alone, surrounded by the symbols of faith that once gave him power, now symbols of his downfall. The ritual had failed, but the fear of that night would linger in Amara's heart forever. In the quiet hours of the early morning, members of the cult who had fled in horror during the ritual crept back into the compound. The once sacred ceremonial hall was still and silent, the candles burned down to stubs. The followers who entered were greeted by a chilling scene, symbols of purity and faith twisted into instruments of control, remnants of ropes and incense, and Elias standing alone, his face contorted with fury and despair as if his entire world had crumbled. The truth of what Elias had done, his manipulation, his obsession with Amara, and the horrific ritual he'd tried to perform, came to light quickly. Word spread through the compound, and whispers of fear and disbelief became cries of betrayal. Sarah and Jonas, shaken but determined, led the remaining survivors to the authorities in the nearest town. For years they had been told that the world outside was corrupt, but they now knew it was Elias, their so-called prophet, who had truly corrupted them. The authorities arrived later that day, shocked by the accounts of survivors who described Elias's control, the abuse, and the brainwashing that had kept them trapped for years. Witnesses recounted the twisted purification rituals, the isolation cells, and the strict punishments for any perceived disobedience. When Elias was finally arrested, he went quietly, a look of cold, terrifying calm on his face, as if he still believed himself to be in the right. The trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the nation. Reporters crowded the courthouse each day, cameras flashing as Elias was led in shackles to face the charges against him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, filled with the weight of years of suffering that survivors now had to relive in their testimonies. Jonas, his voice steady but strained, recounted his attempts to help Amara escape and the brutal punishment Elias had inflicted on him when he'd caught them. He spoke of the fear that had become a daily part of life under Elias's rule, his eyes hardening as he described the torture disguised as purifications. Next, Sarah took the stand, her voice trembling as she described the night Amara tried to escape and the horror they'd discovered in the ceremonial hall. "We thought he was saving us," she whispered, "but he was the one trapping us." Each survivor's story built upon the last, revealing the true horror of Elias's influence. They described the psychological manipulation that had made it nearly impossible to leave, how he had convinced them they were part of a holy mission and used fear to silence any doubts. Some spoke with anger, others with sorrow, as they testified about Amara's bravery, her refusal to let her father break her spirit, and how her defiance had ultimately inspired them to see the truth. Throughout the trial, Elias maintained his silence, his gaze cold and unyielding, as if the courtroom were beneath him. He refused to acknowledge his guilt, instead claiming that he had been carrying out God's will. When questioned directly, he spoke only to reiterate his belief in his mission, casting himself as a prophet who had been wronged by a world unable to understand his divine purpose. After days of harrowing testimony and evidence of his twisted practices, the jury deliberated. On January 15, 2024, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges, including murder, abuse, and the coercive manipulation of vulnerable followers. The judge, addressing Elias directly, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemning his actions as monstrous and inhumane. The survivors in the courtroom let out a collective sigh, a release of years of fear and trauma finally given justice. Outside the courthouse, Sarah, Jonas, and other former cult members gathered, watching as reporters swarmed. Though the trial had ended, they knew their journey was just beginning. Sarah took a deep breath, glancing at Jonas with a look of quiet relief. "It's over," she murmured, though she knew healing would take time. In the weeks that followed, the survivors worked together to rebuild their lives. They sought support and therapy, some returning to family they hadn't seen in years, others choosing to stay in touch with the people who had shared in their pain and resilience. The cult's compound was closed down, its buildings abandoned to the forest, a reminder of the dark chapter they had finally left behind. Though Amara was gone, her courage had left a lasting impact. Her defiance had shattered the cult's hold, allowing the survivors to reclaim their lives. Now free, they moved forward with a new purpose, determined to live without fear and to honor the memory of the girl who had been willing to sacrifice everything to break free. Months had passed since the trial, but Amara's memory lingered like a quiet presence for Sarah and Jonas. Together, they'd moved to a small town far from the shadow of the cult, working to build new lives out of the ashes of their old ones. But in their quiet moments, when the trauma still felt close, they often found themselves thinking of her, of the courage that had shattered the chains holding them all. "She was the only one who dared to stand up to him," Sarah said one day, her voice soft but filled with awe. They sat by a lake on the edge of town, a peaceful spot where they came to reflect. "If Amara hadn't defied him, I don't know where any of us would be. Maybe still in that place believing his lies." Jonas nodded, gazing out over the water. "He made us think that everything he did was for our salvation," he said, the bitterness clear in his voice. "But she saw through it. Even though she knew the risk, she refused to let him take her life away. She was so brave." He paused, shaking his head. "I only wish she could have made it out too." Amara's defiance had changed everything. By daring to say no, to expose her father's twisted obsession, she'd forced open the door for everyone else to see the truth. Her strength had broken the spell Elias had held over them for years, allowing them to finally see the man behind the mask. Because of her, they'd found the courage to leave, to seek justice, and to start over. But it wasn't just the survivors who felt the weight of Amara's legacy. The small town near the compound had been shaken by the horrors that came to light. the townspeople grappling with the knowledge of what had been hidden so close by. Rumors became stories, and soon Amara's name was spoken with respect, her story becoming both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience. The townspeople shared her story as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of truth. One cool autumn afternoon, Sarah and Jonas visited a small memorial they'd helped create, a simple stone marked with Amara's name, surrounded by wildflowers and candles. It had become a place where survivors and townspeople alike came to remember her. They stood before it in silence, the golden leaves drifting down from the trees around them. "I wish she could see this," Sarah whispered, a soft smile tugging at her lips, though her eyes were wet. She'd know she wasn't alone, that her fight meant something. Jonas placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "She gave us a way out, and even though she's gone, she'll always be with us. Her courage, it saved us all." As they stood together, a sense of peace settled over them. The scars of the past would remain, and healing would take time. But here, at the place they'd chosen to honor Amara, they found a measure of comfort. They knew that her bravery had ended a nightmare and begun something new, a chance for freedom, for healing, and for lives built on their own terms. In the quiet, they lit candles and left flowers, promising never to forget the girl who'd been willing to risk everything for the truth. And as they walked away, the soft glow of the candles flickered in the evening light, a reminder of Amara's spirit, unbreakable and forever part of them.